So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Deborah Schoen, and I help coordinate programming here at the Adrian's Memorial Library in Poughkeepsie, and also in the town of Poughkeepsie at the Boardman Road branch. Donald Smith is with us to talk about his book, Steinstuecken, A Cold War Victory for Americans and Berliners. And he's going to introduce himself a little bit more. His presentation, I believe, is about an hour, and he'll entertain questions and answers at the end of his presentation, if there are any. Okay, so thank you, Donald. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us here this evening and sharing your knowledge and your book with us.
Okay, well, Deborah, thank you for the opportunity. A little bit about myself. I am a retired Army officer, and I teach at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. But when I was in college, I studied history, and my first assignment in the Army after graduating college, getting commissioned, was in Germany. Right at the end of the Cold War, 1986 to 1989, and I had a chance to go tour Berlin while it was still divided, while the wall was up, while there was still a West Berlin and an East Berlin. And one day we went and we saw this one community had a really unique Cold War experience and never forgot it. And few years later, once I left the Army, I was in a position where I wanted to write a history book. I always had that. It had just been one of my goals. And I found out that there was no English language history of this community's experiences during the Cold War. So I wrote one, and that's my book, Steinstuecken, A Little Pocket of Freedom. And today I'm here to talk to you about the subject of the book, the Cold War experiences of the people who lived in the German neighborhood of Steinstuecken, and the Americans who safeguarded them, and how their experiences were one of the more unique, little known, but unique episodes of the Cold War. And with that, let's go ahead and move on into the slides. What you're looking at here outlined in red, that is the community of Steinstuecken. It is a suburb of Berlin. It's on the southwest edge of Berlin. If you're familiar with the area around Berlin, the city of Potsdam is to the southwest of Berlin, and Steinstuecken's right next to that. And for those of you that happen to watch German television or German movies, things like Babylon Berlin, which is a popular Netflix series, or the German miniseries Generation War, which was their version of Band Brothers, that was all filmed here. This is Babelsberg. Babelsberg is like Germany's Hollywood, and Steinstuecken is a neighborhood of that. Okay, so I'm going to advance the slides a little bit more, and you see what looks like a hatchet. The blade of the hatchet is the community of Steinstuecken, and the handle of the hatchet is the road that connects Steinstuecken back to the city of West Berlin. And you'll see that around the road is completely surrounded by the territory of the German state of Brandenburg. So the road belongs to the city of Berlin, but the territory on either side of it belongs to the German state of Brandenburg. Now, why that became an important issue, or was an important issue during the Cold War, is this is a map from 1951 put together by the West Berlin government, and it shows the community of Steinstuecken, and you see this hatched line around it. That hatched line symbolizes the border between the American occupation zone of West Berlin that Steinstuecken was part of and the Soviet occupation zone. Well, the state of Brandenburg belonged to the Soviet occupation zone. And as it turns out, during the Cold War, the road in between Steinstuecken and Berlin was not owned by the city of West Berlin. It was owned by the state of Brandenburg. So here's the road. You'll notice there's no hatched line around it. So as the old saying goes, a picture tells you 1,000 words. This picture shows you the dilemma that the Americans had. During the Cold War, they were responsible for protecting somewhere between 150 and 200 people who lived in this neighborhood, and they were separated by about a kilometer from the rest of West Berlin, where the American soldiers and the West Berlin police were. And for 20 years, the Americans managed to keep this village safe and out of communist hands. And in the meantime, the people in the village stayed loyal to the Western cause, and they showed a fair amount of determination and bravery themselves in resisting communist pressure. And my book tells how they did it. So moving on here. To set this groundwork, or set the stage for the story of Steinstuecken, going back to the very end of World War II, I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with this map. This is the modern day country of Germany, and you see it broken up into the four occupation zones. The Soviet zone was over here on the east side, that later became East Germany. And then the British zone in the northwest, the American zone in the south, and the French zone in the southwest later became West Germany. And so you see them broken down here by color. And you'll notice this multicolored patch right in the middle of the Soviet zone, about 100 miles or so from the closest part of the border to the western zones of Germany. That's West Berlin. And the reason West Berlin looks like that is that in 1944, when the Allies were starting to plan their occupation of Germany, because the invasion of D-Day was coming up, they debated what to do with Berlin. Berlin was an important place for many reasons. It had been the capital of Germany. It was one of the major great cities of Europe. And as the current plans were for dividing Germany, all of West Berlin was going to be deep within the side of the Soviet zone. Well, that was a concern to Winston Churchill because he was thinking ahead 5-10 years after the war ended, when the Nazis had been removed from Germany and Germany, denazified Germany, was ready to reunite and become part of the community of nations again. Churchill was concerned that if Berlin had been under total Soviet domination that entire time, you would end up with a Soviet-leaning government. So he called for West Berlin to be occupied jointly by the four wartime Allied powers: the United States, the British, the French, and the Americans. I'm sorry, and the Soviets. And the Soviets agreed to that. So this map you see here shows how the city of Berlin was divided up. And well, I often get asked the question, how did this little neighborhood of Steinstuecken, which is about a kilometer away from the border of West Berlin, become part of the American occupation zone? Well, it happened because of the way that the Allied planners decided to divide up the city. Well, back in 1944, when they were thinking about how they were going to occupy Berlin, the American, British, and Soviet planners, the French weren't included at this time, recognized that Berlin was going to be pretty heavily devastated. And so they knew it would be hard to govern. And somebody pointed out that Berlin is actually made up of a series of boroughs. And you see these borough names here in the map: Lichtenberg, Weissensee, Pankow, Reinichtsdorf. Similar to how New York City is actually comprised of boroughs: Manhattan, Staten Island, the Bronx. And each of those boroughs had their own local governments. So the suggestion was made that rather than just simply draw some lines on a map, instead, the Allies should apportion out the occupation sectors in Berlin by giving each occupying power a certain number of boroughs. And that way, if the Americans or the French wanted to give instructions to the German officials in their occupation sectors, all they would have to do is give the commands to the borough governments and let them do the work. So that's what happened. And so the Americans got 6 boroughs down here in the southwest corner of Berlin. One of them was the borough of Zehlendorf. And through some quirks in German real estate practice and history, the city of the neighborhood of Steinstuecken, which again only had about 200 people in it at this time, was officially treated as part of the borough of Zehlendorf. So the Americans got Steinstuecken along with Zehlendorf once they occupied the city with the rest of the Western Allied powers in July of 1945. The Soviets had the city to themselves for May and June 1945, and then the Americans, British, and French came in July of 1945. Now, if you're looking at this map here, this map was put together in 1945 by Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. This is one of the maps that the Americans had when they first went into the city. Now, Steinstuecken is down here, about where I'm flashing on the screen. you see my pointer moving around. You'll notice that Steinstuecken's not on the map. And the reason for that is that the Americans didn't fully realize that Steinstuecken was part of their area of responsibility. And that made a lot of sense because they were new to the city. The city was still devastated. They were still getting to know, figure out how to work with the Russians. So that's something that just, it literally seemed to miss their attention. Okay, fast forward to 1949. This map was put together in the summer of 1949, a few months after the Berlin airlift ended. And you'll notice that things haven't really changed much. Steinstuecken is not showing up on the map. And this gives you an idea as to what Steinstuecken's status was with the Americans up until the early 1950s. It was something that some people in the staff knew that they were officially responsible for the neighborhood, but nobody really thought about it very much. Well, that all changed 2 years later. In October 1951, the Korean War has started, the Cold War is starting to heat up, and the Soviets are starting to crack down on West Berlin. And so on October 18th, 1951, border guards from the new German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, surrounded the neighborhood of Steinstuecken and posted announcements proclaiming that Steinstuecken was now officially going to become part of the city of Potsdam and the land of Brandenburg. And the reason that this was important is this was a direct challenge by the East Germans and undoubtedly their Soviet patrons to American authority, because while the public may not have known much about it, it was pretty well known in the occupation headquarters circles that Steinstuecken officially belonged to the Americans. And now the East Germans were challenging that. All right. So why did that matter? As I said, Steinstuecken had less than 200 people in it. It had nothing of real strategic value to the city of West Berlin or the American occupation authorities. There wasn't a power plant there, or water reservoir, or university, or major government facility. It's what we consider to be a bedroom community nowadays. It didn't have a grocery store, didn't have a school, didn't have a gas station. So it was really a good way to think of it as a neighborhood. The reason it was important, though, was highlighted by a report in 1967 that the CIA wrote on several areas of territory that were surrounded the city of Berlin that officially belonged to West Berlin but weren't physically attached to it. Now, most of these places were like garden plots or farmers' fields. Steinstuecken was the only significant place that was not attached to West Berlin. And as the CIA said in their report, as I just said here, there was nothing strategically significant in Steinstuecken, but these various detached areas were significant mainly because they provided the Soviet Union with a ready means of testing Western resolve. So anytime they threatened those detached areas, that made the people in West Berlin and West Germany very nervous. And there are several reasons for that. First, the West Berliners, it's been 6 years since the war ended. The Cold War is in full force. And some people in West Berlin are starting to get concerned that the Americans might be losing their desire to protect West Berlin. Remember, the Korean War is going on now. So America has a heavy demand on its military assets completely on the other side of the globe. And that made the people in West Berlin feel very isolated and very sensitive to any indication that the Americans might be losing their resolve to keep them safe. Also, the West Berliners were concerned that they had been separated from the rest of the western part of the country, West Germany, for 6 months, and there was some concern that Westerners were just starting to write them off. And so the West Berliners felt really isolated. Now, as for the West Germans themselves, the people in the American, British, French sectors, there was never any concern that they were going to join the Soviet Union willingly. But what the Americans were concerned about was that they knew that the West Germans were concerned about the fact that their country had been divided for 6 years. It had literally broken into an eastern and a western half, and the West Germans very much wanted to see their country reunify. And as the Cold War went on, they started to become concerned that that might never happen. Well, the Soviets played into that. So what the Soviets did in the early 1950s, they started a propaganda campaign where the Soviets started calling for German reunification. They called for a peace treaty to be concluded with the Western powers and for East and West Germany to reunify. And when the West balked at that, the Soviets started putting out propaganda claiming that it was the Americans who were holding up German reunification. And this cartoon that you see here is indicative of the kind of propaganda that they were putting out in the early 1950s, which is when the Steinstuecken crisis occurred. This is from an East German propaganda magazine. So what you see here is that this table is the metaphor for Germany, and the table has been split in half. You have a Western half and an Eastern half. And you have valiant West Germans and valiant East Germans trying to push their table back together, but they're being prevented from doing that by the stereotypical American militarist, the stereotypical Nazi that the East Germans claimed were actually active in the West German government. This character here is meant to symbolize Konrad Adenauer, who had become the Chancellor of West Germany. And these concerns about hindering reunification did play a lot on the minds of West Germans. So again, there was no concern in the American government that the West Germans would want to join the Soviet Union, but they were getting very concerned that their country might be being separated forever, and that made them sensitive about a bunch of things. All right. So moving on. Now, it could have been argued that the United States could have said, well, West Germany, I understand you're in a tough situation, but you're just going to have to deal with it. Cold War's going on. You're a divided, weakened country. There's not much you can do about it. Well, in late 1951, when the Steinstuecken crisis happened, the United States found itself in a situation where it needed the support of West Germany. It actively needed West German emotional, morale, and physical support. And that had been a big change. Because in the years prior, in between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, the United States, by and large, had treated Germany as a defeated country, a country that needed to be punished and made to feel the pain of being defeated and feel the guilt for spawning the Nazi regime. This phrase that you see up here on the screen, Germany was no longer someone to be stepped on. That was a quote from a State Department official in 1951, and he was referring to how the Americans had in many ways treated West Germany in the years prior. They had treated them deliberately as a defeated nation. So there's one anecdote I have to tell you that to illustrate that. Shortly after World War II ended, and the Western powers came into Berlin, so you had all four of the occupying powers in Berlin. The Berlin Philharmonic reformed, and the Allied powers allowed it to play on the condition that before every concert, they had to play the national anthems of all four of the occupying powers. So there were things like that that the Allies did to make the Germans feel defeated. Well, in October 1951, though, now we needed to get the Germans to be willing to work with us, and here are several reasons why. First, you know about the Korean War that had been going on for about a year and a half at this time. So we needed the West German government to support the Western European defense effort because we had just stood up NATO. We're trying to rebuild Western European armies so they could stand up against the Soviets. And the West German economy was one of the strongest economies in Europe at this time. So we needed their help. And so we needed their cooperation. We weren't really in a position where we could order them to build certain things. We needed them to be willing to adjust their developing economy so it could provide a fair amount of military support. In late 1951, there was an initiative going on called the Schuman Plan. And the idea behind the Schuman Plan was to get the Germans to give up control of their steel and coal resources and put them under an international consortium. Now, the idea behind that was that that would then lessen tensions in Europe, because the thinking was that if you had an international consortium running German steel and coal resources, the chances are drastically reduced that they can rearm and start a third world war. Well, Needless to say, we needed the Germans to go along with that. The Germans had national pride, and they weren't too keen on giving up their coal and steel resources. Okay. We also needed the Germans to be willing to integrate their economy with the other economies and the other agricultural systems of the other countries in Western Europe. And the main reason for that was the Americans had determined that Western Europe was not really in a position to feed itself, because when the Cold War started, most of the prime agricultural areas and the European continent were over in the Eastern sector, in the Soviet sector, the Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. That's where all the great wheat fields were. And so the Soviets had control of that. And so what the Americans wanted the Western European countries, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, to do was to get together and integrate their agricultural operations so that they could potentially feed themselves. Well, you needed the Germans to agree to that too. And the last problem that the Americans were dealing with this time is they were trying to figure some way to actually end the state of war. We were still officially at war with Germany, and we wanted to integrate Germany, especially its economy, back into the world economy. So the way that you normally end a war is to have a peace treaty. Well, the only way to have a peace treaty that officially ended World War II was to get the Soviets to cooperate, because they were one of our wartime partners. They were not going to cooperate with the peace treaty. So they came up with this idea that instead of having a treaty, what they would do is the Americans, British, and French would conclude a series of contracts with the Germans, and those essentially would function like treaties. That would enable the state of war to end, and then Germany could exchange ambassadors with all the other countries, and it could become a full-up peacetime nation. Well, again, you needed the Germans to agree to those contracts too. So when the Steinstuecken crisis started, you might have seen on one of the earlier slides, I said it was like a canary in a coal mine. Well, the canary itself isn't all that important if the canary falls over and dies. But what you're concerned about are the messages that would come out if the canary died. And the idea being that if Steinstuecken fell into Soviet hands, there was real concern in the American government that West Berlin and West Germany might lose their desire to be strong partners with the United States. So that's why the United States was so concerned about this neighborhood that didn't even have a grocery store in it. All right. So the gentleman you see here on the left is Ernst Reuter. He is the mayor of West Berlin. He was the mayor of West Berlin during the Berlin airlift, became an international hero, especially a hero in the United States. And Reuter understood the PR situation the Americans were facing. So what he did was he became a stern advocate of the neighborhood of Steinstuecken. These quotes that you see over here on the slides are things that he said to the press immediately after the neighborhood was surrounded. He also gave another interview in which he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, for the Americans, Steinstuecken is a case of test. And he used the word a case of test. So the Americans knew they were on the spot here. And the gentleman who had to handle this was Major General Lemuel Matthewson. That's his picture there on the right-hand side. He was the U.S. military commandant in Berlin. So he was a senior U.S. military official. Now, he did not leave a diary, and as far as we've been able to see in the historical files in Washington, he didn't leave a detailed after-action report on exactly what his thinking was during the crisis. So we've had to kind of piece together what his thoughts were and what his intent was based on some of the messages he sent out. And it became pretty clear that he was not ready to send U.S. troops into Steinstuecken to rescue it. He wasn't ready to start a war with the Russians. But he also understood that he couldn't back down, or he understood the political problems with backing down. So apparently what happened is Matthewson decided to bluff. What he did was he called together a bunch of newspaper reporters and made it very clear that even though Steinstuecken was a small place, the Americans were committed to it. The Americans had said they promised to defend all of West Berlin, all of their occupation sector. Steinstuecken was part of their occupation sector, and so they were going to stand firm. And from what it appears, the bluff worked. The Soviets backed down. They pulled the East German police away from Steinstuecken and allowed the Americans to reassert authority over it. And there was celebration in West Berlin. What you're looking at here is a political cartoon that ran in a West Berlin newspaper. On the right-hand side, we see Matthewson, the German Jaeger, the hunter, dressed in the hunter's outfit. And next to him is Mama Berlin, who is now holding baby Steinstuecken, who has been rescued from the belly of the slain communist wolf here. All right. So a big PR victory for the Americans, but at this point now, as the phrase, to do a riff on the phrase, if you break it, you own it. Well, now that the Americans had made a point of protecting Steinstuecken, their credibility was now on, they were now on the hook for protecting Steinstuecken, and their credibility was at risk. So that leads us into the rest of the 1950s. And so what happened is after the October crisis, essentially the Americans and the Soviets stood back, and they came to the conclusion that neither of them wanted to start World War III over a village with less than 200 people. And so what they did was they did things to keep the tensions down. For example, the Americans didn't station soldiers in the village or try to send troops there. And the Soviets kept the East Germans from trying to occupy the village again. So what happened was throughout the 1950s, you had this uneasy peace in the village of Steinstuecken. So the people lived in the village. They followed their normal daily routines. There was a wooden path that took about 1 kilometer from the village into West Berlin, where they could then pick up the bus to go to school or work. And they would go to work or school every day, and they would go through two East German checkpoints. You see one of the checkpoints here, the bar for one of the checkpoints. And East German guards would check their passes. And for the most part, that was pretty much it. Now, every so often, the East German government would harass Steinstuecken just to see if they get a response out of the Americans. For example, they would prevent the fire brigade, West Berlin Fire Brigade, from going to Steinstuecken, or they would prevent milk deliveries, or they would prevent electricians from coming in. And then in that particular case, what you would have, and so what you're looking at here on the screen is an incident that happened in 1955. Steinstuecken was a pretty rural place, and at this point, it only had one electric refrigerator in it. Well, the refrigerator broke. So the East Germans would not allow electricians from West Berlin to come and fix a refrigerator. So the West Berlin mayor, this gentleman here that you see, that he's got a microphone in front of him and he's balding and he's got glasses, he decided to make a PR issue out of it. And he announced that he was going to go down the woodland path and visit the people in his constituents in Steinstuecken and check out the refrigerator. So, of course, the press was there, and he shows up, and here on the left-hand side, you see the East German guards refusing him access to the village. Well, that got a lot of press. And a few days later, 2 Soviet army officers went into Steinstuecken, looked at the refrigerator, and they determined that, yes, indeed, it was broken. And quietly shortly thereafter, arrangements were made for getting the refrigerator to be fixed. Now, whenever you had flare-ups like this, like, for example, when the East German border guards blocked the mailman from coming into Steinstuecken, the way it was handled was that the Americans did not allow the people of Steinstuecken, in most cases, to talk directly to the East Germans because we didn't officially recognize the government of East Germany. So you had the Americans directing people in their occupation zone to conduct official business with the East Germans. That could be taken as tantamount recognition of the East Germans. So instead, what happened was the Americans had the people in Steinstuecken file their complaint with the American occupation officials. And then the American occupation officials, well, they wouldn't go talk to the East Germans either, because again, we don't recognize their authority. So what they did was they went and they talked to the Soviets, because technically at this time, World War II was still going on. There'd been no peace treaty. So the Soviets were still officially our allies. So we would go to the Soviets, talk to them. They would then talk to the East Germans. And that's how life went in Steinstuecken for about 10 years, from early 1950s to right before the Berlin Wall crisis. And believe it or not, things worked out pretty well because for the most part, the people of Steinstuecken didn't want to harass the border guards because they wanted to live a nice, quiet life. And the Americans didn't want a problem, and the Soviets didn't want a problem. Both the Americans and the Soviets recognized that they'd kind of been stuck with this unique situation because of the nature of the Cold War, and they decided just to manage it. And so things worked well for about 10 years until August 1961, the Berlin Wall crisis. At that point, all bets were off. All previous arrangements were up for reconsideration. The East Germans then surrounded the village of Steinstuecken with barbed wire. Up until then, people in Steinstuecken had been able to walk back and forth between neighborhoods in East Berlin, or in the state of Brandenburg. But now they were sealed off with barbed wire. And so you see this picture here of a little boy who had been playing for years with his friends in Steinstuecken. That boy's in East Germany. Now he's blocked out by the wire. So it made for a real touching story, touched a lot of heartstrings, went out throughout the world media. But I did find out later on that the boy was a crafty little fellow. He found a hole in the fence and was able to sneak through and play with his friends anyway. But it's still a good picture. So the people in Steinstuecken, though, were concerned that if the East Germans had sealed off half of Berlin, they might be coming for Steinstuecken next. And so that problem was presented to this gentleman. This is General Lucius Clay. Lucius Clay was the U.S. military governor of Germany during the Berlin airlift. He was one of the primary forces that convinced President Truman to devote the air assets necessary to sustain the Berlin airlift. Well, Clay had retired by 1961, but President Kennedy knew that the people of West Berlin thought Clay was a hero. They revered him. They called him the father of the air bridge, der Vater der Luftbrücke. And so he knew that that Clay had a lot of influence on them. So he asked Clay to go to Berlin and be his personal representative. So Clay arrived there in mid-September 61, noticed that morale was really low and were looking for some way to lift the morale of the people of West Berlin, but he needed to do it in such a way that it wouldn't start a conflict. He didn't have the authority to actually start a shooting war. So he had to be very careful. And then the West Berliners told him about Steinstuecken. Well, Clay couldn't drive there, but as it turns out, there was an unanticipated consequence of the immediate post-World War II planning that worked in his favor. We're just now finishing the 75th anniversary of the Berlin airlift, May 12th. Actually, Sunday was the 75th anniversary of the end of the airlift. And the airlift was possible because the Soviets, immediately after the Western Allies came into Berlin in the summer 1945, made some airspace agreements with the other three powers to help avoid air congestion over the city of Berlin. Anyone who's been to Berlin, especially in the fall and the winter, there's lots of fog. It can be a very bad place to fly into. You don't want planes flying around there above the city not being controlled because you could have an accident. So what they did was they came up with 3 air corridors that the Soviets approved that the Americans and the British could use and the French could use to fly into West Berlin. And those were the corridors that they used for the Berlin airlift. The Soviets respected those. Well, also as part of that agreement, they agreed to have a 25-kilometer radius zone around this, a 32-kilometer radius zone around the city of Berlin so that aircraft would have a place to loiter while they're waiting to land at one of the Berlin airfields. And the understanding was that any aircraft from any of the occupying powers could fly anywhere within this circular control zone that I'm showing you here that you see in the middle of the screen without pre-clearance from any other power. You know, you could fly wherever you wanted to. And Steinstuecken is right about here. So what happened was one morning, the people in Steinstuecken who were going to stay in the village during the day, the ones who hadn't gone to school or gone to work, they're working in their gardens and they hear helicopter blades. They look up, U.S. Army helicopter lands, and out steps one of the most famous men in West Berlin. And the people instantly recognize him. they rush to him, and they instantly realize that the fact that he has flown out there is an important signal. And that's exactly why Clay flew out there. He flew out there and he made some statements to the press. And he said that he was flying out there to the most isolated, most vulnerable spot of West Berlin to demonstrate that the Americans were willing to protect all of West Berlin. And it was a huge PR boost. It was a huge morale boost for the people in West Berlin. And it's something that the people in Steinstuecken remember to this day. Now, Clay, though, was no fool. Actually, let me cover this one picture, and then I'll move on. This, going back to the old phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This picture here was taken as Clay's helicopter is flying away. So in the foreground, you see the people of Steinstuecken. Now in the background, you see a bunch of other people, and it looks like they're all lined up against something. These are the neighbors of the Steinstuecken residents right here. And they are being kept away from their former neighbors, people that they had known for decades, by the brand new wire fence that had been kept up. So this later became the Berlin Wall. So if you want to see the separation that the Cold War caused, this picture, here it is all in one picture. Now, going back to the fact that when I was saying that Clay was no dummy, he reasoned that the Soviets could just as easily wait for his helicopter to leave, wait a month or two until the press interest died down and the world attention moved somewhere out there, and then move in on Steinstuecken. So he decided to not take any chances. What he did was he directed Berlin Brigade, the U.S. Army's Berlin Brigade, to send a military police detachment into the city of Steinstuecken to establish a presence patrol. Basically, they established an outpost. And so what happened was they flew in about 3 to 4 MPs. They established a watch office in the basement of the mayor's house. They ran a communications wire up his chimney, put an antenna at the top, and they used that and a telephone to communicate with Berlin Brigade headquarters. And so what the MPs did was first they provided boots on the ground. They provided a presence patrol. They didn't have any major weapons. There was only 4 of them there at any one time. So they certainly weren't capable of withstanding a sustained assault, much less repelling one. But they essentially functioned as a tripwire to make it very clear that if the Soviets or the East German messed with them, they then ran the risk of messing with the entire United States military and government. And then the MPs also periodically did patrols around the fence. The U.S. government maintained that that base for 11 years, from 1961 to 1972. They would fly MPs out every 3 or 4 days. And so here you see the MPs on duty in the village. This is one of my favorite pictures. You see a East German workman over here working on the wall that separates Steinstuecken from East Germany. You see an East German soldier watching the East German worker, and then you see 2 MPs watching all of them. The Cold War in a nutshell. I'm going to skip through this one here in the interest of time. You might have heard about something called the Death Strip. This was a cleared area that the East Germans had all the way around West Berlin. Well, they had this around Steinstuecken too. So anybody who tried to break into Steinstuecken, especially in the later years of the U.S. military presence in the village, they would then have to cross this cleared area. Very dangerous. Right. All right. So what was life in Steinstuecken once the Americans came? Well, lots of dignitaries would come because the word spread that it was a unique place, so people wanted to come see it. So General Clay came back a few times. This is Willy Brandt, who is the mayor of West Berlin. And here you see the new U.S. Commandant of Berlin. The gentleman behind him in the pile cap is the commander of the Berlin Brigade, and these are West German officials. So it was not uncommon to have dignitaries come to Steinstuecken. And when they did, it was inevitably a big event for the whole village, especially the kids. And they would just tag along with the presentation. And as you see here in this picture, you've got one general talking to another general and 2 kids hanging around just like they belong there, just like anybody else. In the book, I relate the story of one girl who grew up in the village, and she said that, and she talked about a story when one of the helicopters came in to bring in a relief detachment, and while they were doing the transloading, the pilots revved up the main blade of the helicopter to get some prop wash going, and the little kids would lean into the prop wash, and for the really light kids, the prop wash actually held them up. So it's kind of like a carnival ride. Let's skip through this slide here in the interest of time because running a little long here. The Americans built a really strong bond with the people in Steinstuecken. Needless to say, the people in Steinstuecken were grateful to have the Americans there. But then the American military kind of took the village under its wing in the 1960s, early 1970s. And these pictures are some signs of that. If you look at this play set, if you say to yourself, it looks like a helicopter, well, that was the intent. It was made by Berlin Brigade technicians. And so you can see the blade up here, a ladder that functions as a blade. You see the cockpit of the helicopter. And in this particular case, you've got a West German official who's throwing candy out to the kids. And then over here, you see kids do what kids do when candy gets thrown to them. And that is still there, by the way. That place set is still there in Steinstuecken. Down here at the bottom, you see Steinstuecken children who are attending Thanksgiving dinner at the American Military Police Mess Hall. So for those of you that have served in the American military, especially overseas, you know that Thanksgiving and Christmas are big deals for the command. The cooks lay out an incredible spread of food. Everybody comes in their dress uniforms. And so shortly after the MPs arrived in Steinstuecken in the early 1960s, what they would do is they would fly Thanksgiving dinner in travel cans into Steinstuecken and share it with the people of the village. And then they added to that a tradition where they would take the school children, the school-age children, put them on buses, drive them to the barracks, and they would then celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner with the MPs, and that's what you see here in the pictures on the bottom. A few other little interesting tidbits from life in Steinstuecken. Because Berlin was still under occupation, the only authorities that had the ability to fly over Berlin were the 4 occupation authorities. West Germans were not, and West Berliners were not authorized to fly over the city, and apparently neither was Santa Claus. So here you've got an Army helicopter bringing Santa Claus in for his annual visit. Over here on the right-hand side, you see this orange bus. It's painted like a school bus for a reason. That was the school bus that took children from Steinstuecken to school in Berlin and back. And one of the reasons I included it here is to highlight something that's important to remember about the Steinstuecken experience. When we think about the Cold War, we often think about worldwide events like the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin Wall crisis. But in the case of Steinstuecken, the Cold War was a very personal day-to-day thing for them. If you lived in Steinstuecken, but you had a job or you went to school, you went through East German checkpoints every day. If you went into your backyard, you would see East German's guards looking down on you from the watchtowers. And generally at a personal level, even though mainly the governments would bicker, at a personal level, the East German border guards and the people in Steinstuecken just found a way to get along. And in the book, I've got 2 anecdotes that I want to share 2 anecdotes in the book. One of them is that some of the mothers in Steinstuecken came up with a brilliant idea. You know how when kids misbehave, every so often they get grounded, and so they have to stay at the house. And for kids in Steinstuecken, that meant if you were grounded, you weren't allowed to ride your bicycle in the West Berlin. So some mothers came up with the idea of going to the East German border guards and telling them which kids had been grounded, because in most cases, the border guards knew all the kids in the village. So a mom would go up and say, hey, Hans is grounded. He can't go into West Berlin. And then a few hours later, Hans and his friends would get on his bike and they'd ride up to the checkpoint
And there are stories where the guard said, Hans, your mom's told us you're grounded. We're not lifting the checkpoint barrier for you. And they would keep him stuck in Steinstuecken. Okay, now let's get to this bus here. Well, the lady who drove the bus, she's a Steinstuecken resident, and it was almost impossible for people in Steinstuecken who had family in West Berlin to get them to visit, because you had to get approval from the East German government, and you generally never got the approval. So the bus driver said to herself one day, my nephew is in West Berlin. I'd like to bring him in just for some tea, and then I can take him home later. And so she reasoned that she would pick him up when she was bringing the kids back from school. And the bus driver, the East German guards would just presume that he was one of the kids in the village and wouldn't say anything about it. Well, remember how I said that some of the guards knew all the kids in the village? So the bus pulls up to the East German checkpoint going into Steinstuecken, and the East German border guard looks in, points right at the boy and says, "Who is that?" And she says, "Oh, that's my son." And the guard's like, "No, I know you. I know your kids. He is not officially part of this village." Now, technically, she was breaking the rules, and she was on East German territory at that point. The East Germans could have pulled her out of the bus and arrested her. There could have been a big incident, but apparently the guard was a pretty decent sort, and he said, "Look, we're going to do shift change in about 2 hours. Just make sure you have him out of here by then." And there are all sorts of stories like that the Steinstuecken residents told, because when the Cold War was fought at a very personal level for them, and they found out ways just to be able to get along with the East Germans so that life could go on. In 1972, as part of the Dayton Accords, the East German government sold a strip of land to West Berlin. That strip of land connected Steinstuecken to West Berlin. West Berlin built a road on it. Here's the road. And on each side of the road, the East Germans built the Berlin Wall. And so for people to ask me, how did I come to know Steinstuecken? In 1988, I was on a tour group that went down this road. And if anyone spent any time in West Germany and you see those roads, that looks like pretty much any country lane that you would see in a small country town or a small neighborhood. And we drove down, our bus drove down that road, and we're on this road, and we see on both sides the Berlin Wall, watchtowers. It was just one of the weirdest things we had ever seen. It was like we were driving down this tunnel, and at the other end was this little community. And that's how I came to know Steinstuecken. And so these pictures are from the day that the road opened. And at that point, then the American MP detachment left, and Steinstuecken officially became part of West Berlin. All right. So these are some pictures that were taken at events after the road was opened. The American Aviation Detachment especially kept close ties with the people of Steinstuecken. And you see some up in the upper right-hand corner, these are pictures that were taken at the Steinstuecken Summerfest when the Americans brought a helicopter out and they let the people of Steinstuecken go through it. This is what Steinstuecken looks like today. There is a memorial to the American helicopter airlift. These are a pair of Huey main rotor blades that have been put on a pedestal. And in the background, there's that helicopter play set that I talked about. The residents of Steinstuecken maintain it, so their grandkids now play on it. And they try to keep the memory of the American-German ties alive. For example, this is their clubhouse. These are relatively recent pictures, only a few years ago. This was a portion of a tail rotor, which was then sawed off and then painted and turned into a memento. And these are all part of the community clubhouse in Steinstuecken to this day. Okay, now, this is a list of the main sources that I use. Deborah, I've sent Deborah a link to Google Drive to my presentation. She's welcome to copy these slides. And most of these are available online. So like, for example, the book, The City Becomes a Symbol, The City Becomes a Symbol, that is a U.S. Army history of the first 5 years of the occupation. That is a free download. The Germany Country Reader is a collection of recollections and interviews for former State Department officials. The one for Germany is over 1,000 pages. I use that a lot in my book. That is a free download. The Berlin Observer was the community newspaper of the U.S. military community in Berlin from the end of World War II up until the Americans actually left in 1994. That's still available online at that website. So if you want to learn more about the American experience in Berlin during the Cold War, you can do a lot of reading for free. I'm going to close off with this slide. I know that your library has gotten a copy of my book, but I'm sure it comes as no surprise that if some of y'all are interested in buying a copy of my book, I would be greatly appreciative. It is available from my publisher, Acclaim Press. And so you can go to their website, acclaimpress.com, and you can type in the name Steinstuecken. And I know it's kind of long, but it's unfortunately that's the name we have to deal with. And then a link to buying my book will pop up. That way I get the most money off it and my publisher gets the most money off it. But you can also get the book through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart has it. The easiest way to find it if you go to Amazon is go to the main search page, type in the word Stein, like a beer stein, S-T-E-I-N, and the letter is S-T, like St. Louis, St. Paul, Stein, S-T, and then the link will pop up and the book's available there. If you want to reach me, there's my contact information. And that ends my presentation. So at this point, I'm open for questions.
Donald, thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed it.
I don't know if anybody has any questions. Let me see if I can. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and we don't have too many people, so just unmute yourself and ask them if you don't mind. There's a question here. Was there any changes to the population in the town over those decades?
Interestingly, yes. They lost a fair when the Cold War started, there were about 300 people in the town. The number then dropped to about 200 or so, but it stayed somewhere between 150 and 200 during the 1950s because there was a lot of people in Steinstuecken who liked living there. Very quickly, they determined that they could trust the Americans to protect them. And there were several benefits to living in Steinstuecken. For example, it's a very quiet place. And if you live in a major metropolitan area, it's generally not very quiet. There's a lot of road noise and such. But living in Steinstuecken was like living in a forest. And also, one of the residents said that because the West Berlin police couldn't come to the village, neither could the tax collector. So there were definitely benefits to it. And then once in the mid 1960s, once they extended the Berlin Wall all the way around the village, and then especially in the 1970s when that road opened up, Steinstuecken real estate became really a hot commodity because people recognized that it was a safe place to live. And very quickly, the prices shot up. So the locals weren't too happy with that. Taxes went up. But I think there were about 250, 300 people living in Steinstuecken by the time that the wall actually came down.
Anybody else have any more questions? So do you know the population today, Donald?
No, actually, the city, Steinstuecken really has been pretty much absorbed by the other communities around there. The whole Death Strip area has been covered up with housing. So, it's really lost its little community feel. It literally just does feel like a neighborhood now. I think there's still only about 250, 300 people that actually live in the neighborhood itself, maybe a few more because, for example, they've now built some housing on what used to be the helipad that the Army helicopters used. So that's the most I know about the population.
Okay, so it says, were there any attempts from East Germans to flee there?
Yes, there were quite a few in the 50s and the 60s and in the early 60s, and especially after the Berlin Wall went up. And for the first few months, people were able to breach the barbed wire around Steinstuecken pretty easily. Matter of fact, there was one case that I mentioned in the book where somebody drove a school bus through it. And so the front part of the school bus got stuck in Steinstuecken. The back part of the school bus was stuck in East Germany. So the East German border guards are coming through the back part while the refugees were going out through the front part, and they were being protected by the American MPs. That happened a fair number of times. Now, shortly thereafter, the East Germans built a really strong barbed wire barrier around the perimeter. And then a few years later, they followed that up with a concrete wall. And that pretty much stopped people coming into the village, with one exception. There was an East German rail line that went through the village, and it took freight into Berlin. And so the trains had to go through Steinstuecken. So the East German guards would watch the trains closely, but every so often somebody would be able to hide on a boxcar, and they would jump off in Steinstuecken.
Mary Volpe asked, did you return to Steinstuecken to do any research or to speak with any of the residents? Like, when's the last time you were there?
I haven't been there since the Cold War. I was able to do all of this over the internet and talk to them on the phone. I am, though, finally going to get a chance to visit them. I'm going to go see them in September.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
That's exciting.
looking forward to it.
Maybe you could do a head count when you're over there.
I will.
Great, I think. Did you learn German, Donald, when you were over there?
I knew some, basically enough to get by it, so Germans could understand me. I really could. I'm certainly not fluent. I wasn't fluent then, but I was able to get around.
Yeah, so that's great. That's a great piece of history that you carved out for us in this little village, Steinstuecken. Thank you so much for your expertise and for sharing your knowledge on the whole situation over there.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to tell the story. One of the reasons I wrote the book is that the residents of Steinstuecken who lived there during the Cold War, they're starting to pass on. And so they wanted their story recorded. And so it just turned out to be, a perfect match. And so I wanted to write a book. They wanted to tell their stories. And so I was able to do it all through the internet, Skype, Zoom, and also because so much stuff is online, there was a wealth of material to find.
Oh, great presentation. And I look forward to reading your book. I haven't had a chance yet.
Okay. Well, again, please tell everybody about it. I'll be I will be grateful if people buy copies, obviously, my publisher especially. So please spread the word, and thank you for this opportunity today.
Thank you so much, Donald. Thanks for being with us.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Everybody have a good one. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. So we're just going to end the meeting.